Okay, we've talked about the Cold War from 1945 all the way to 1991. And if there was a thread running through that near half century of time after World War II, it was the Cold War because of the potential to blow the world up and destroy civilization. It was a very existential time in which there was a lot of fear of the bomb. There was other stuff going on too. And the thing about World War II is that it was really a coming out party for the United States as the dominant country in the world. That was hinted at after World War I, and we kind of ran away and hid into isolation. But after World War II, when we certainly believed that we had rescued the world and did a great deal to rescue the world from totalitarian governments, we didn't retreat. We organized the UN, and we were, from that time on, a player in the world. And big changes at home, too. And we'll take a quick look at those now in the period from 1945 to 1960. The 60s were a different animal than the 50s. The first issue was reconversion. We talked about reconversion after World War I, but it's the process of getting off of a war footing and back to a peace footing. And let's remember that World War II grew out of a time that in our country was the time of the Great Depression and Roosevelt's New Deal. And there was a big fear once everyone was to work either being in the service fighting the war or working 24/7, 365 to make supplies for the war, that after the war we'd go right back to the Depression. There was a fear. There was also a fear that we had done the servicemen wrong at the end of World War I, and one of the problems of the 20s that was hidden and then of the 30s that wasn't hidden is that the servicemen of World War I remained poor for the most part. We remember maybe the bonus army. So one of the very greatest pieces of legislation ever passed by the U.S. Congress was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, but known to everybody as the GI Bill, for short, the GI Bill of Rights. And basically what it did is it provided funds, low-cost loans to returning servicemen for education, mortgages for homes or businesses, and business startup costs. All were paid for through extremely low-cost loans for servicemen. Many thousands of ex-GIs, hence the name, government-issued soldiers, got their college education or post-secondary training in some field because of the GI Bill. And that meant for a very qualified workforce after World War II emerged. In that sense, the GI Bill was a major contribution to the United States' long-term economic growth and the outgrowth of a huge, what we now think of as the middle class, people who didn't have it made by any means. They went to work every day, but they had a lot of qualifications and commanded more money than they would have had they just come back as 1930s kids, young men for the most part in the early 1940s, and now older young men with no particular qualifications being dumped on the workforce in 1945, 46, 47. And the GI Bill has been renewed many times since, and maybe you know or don't know, if you know anyone that's in the service or has been in the past 10 or 15 years, there's a post 9/11 GI Bill that still applies. So the fear that we'd fall back into the Great Depression just didn't happen. Enough money was saved that there was a burst of spending right after the war, and because there was so much spending, that continued right along. Now, there were some problems because the workers went on strike for higher pay, so they could have higher buying power too. And there were some conflicts over that. President Truman tried to stop a coal miners' strike by having the government seize the mines, which was illegal. And Congress passed a law to curb the power of unions for fear that they feared that wages would go too high. It created a right to work to either be in a union or not. But for the most part, the economy hummed along right after the war and really didn't stop for the next 15 or 20 years. There were also the hint of some things that were to come, and one of those major things was the civil rights movement, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about a little bit later. But Truman, the president, believed that the war had exposed some of the inequalities of the Jim Crow era were not only silly and demeaning, but actually hurt the war effort. For example, they segregated blood so that if you were a white wounded soldier and the only blood they had was black blood, it's all red of course, you couldn't get it, and vice versa. So he founded a committee on civil rights to look into the matter, and they debated in 1946, 1947, and they made several important recommendations when they get done with their studies. Here's what they recommended: outlawing the poll tax, which kept blacks from voting; creating a permanent Fair Labor Practices Commission. We talked in World War II about the creation of the Fair Labor Practices Committee, Presidential Order 8802, that created that to allow African Americans to work in federal projects, and what a great success it was, and they wanted to make it permanent. 3, strengthening civil rights law, including laws making lynching a federal crime. And really, the centerpiece for that era was to desegregate the U.S. military. It seemed like a waste of manpower and equipment power, and made logistics difficult to have almost parallel army units in the segregated army. As a practical matter, and it didn't seem right in a rights matter. And so in 1948, Truman issued his own executive order, 9981, which abolished segregation in the armed forces. Just did it by proclamation. And he asked Congress to pass a civil rights bill that would address those other recommendations. Now, this caused a huge outcry against these equality-inducing measures. He was a Democrat. He was a president, but he was a member of the Democratic Party, and he demanded the Democratic Party adopt a policy supporting civil rights per this commission's recommendations for the 1948 election. And there was a severe white backlash against that in 1948. Now, if we know anything about politics in the 21st century, which we may or may not do, we know that there is a very strong element of the Republican Party is in the South. It's a very solid Republican-dominated area. Well, that was not always the case, and from the time of the Civil War until about 1980, say, the South, the solid South, was a Democratic stronghold, and there was never an election that the Democrats didn't carry the states of the ex-Confederacy. There's a huge rebellion within the Democratic Party from Southern members, and in fact, many of them walked out and they formed their own party, Dixiecrat. Get it? Democrat. Dixiecrat, Democrat. And they nominated Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, who was a strict segregationist, segregation, separation of races, and a proponent of Jim Crow, to be their presidential candidate. There's not enough troops in the Army to force Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, swimming pools, homes, or churches. So he is strictly for the color line. Because of the split, it was widely believed the Republicans would win. Anytime a party has a split, usually the other party wins. And the Republican candidate was a very attractive candidate by the name of Tom Dewey, governor of New York, and he was obviously favored to win because of this political calculus. But Truman went out and he campaigned very hard against Congress and against the Dixiecrats and in favor of his platform. And he went around the country, and every on a presidential train, and at every railroad station he would stop when the whistle would blow and the train would stop. He'd go out on the back of the last car and give a speech. And then he'd go on to the next one. There was no TV. I mean, TV had been invented, but nobody had any TVs. Nobody had any sort of social media. So if you wanted to hear the president, or any candidate, you would go and listen to them speak live. And there he is at the back of his train. And lo and behold, Truman won. Was considered an upset. In fact, you can see Dewey defeats Truman, and there's Truman laughing about it because the newspaper had to go to press in time for the first edition, and they got it wrong, and Truman was reelected. And he tried to implement sort of a younger brother of the New Deal, to carry on the New Deal. You may know that one of the controversial issues of the 21st century is the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare. Well, President Truman, he was not the first to think of it, but he made a major push as part of his so-called Fair Deal to pass a national health care bill, which was defeated. The civil rights legislation he was in favor of was defeated. Minimum wage law was passed. National Housing Act was passed. But it was only a mixed deal. The Fair Deal was not really a success the way the New Deal was. It was a different era. Americans had just spent 10 years in a depression and 5 years in a world war, and they were more ready to relax than they were to pick up causes. 1952, and we've already talked about this in connection with the Cold War, former General Eisenhower was elected president. We know that he believed in massive retaliation and as a way to avoid war. And he was a conservative, but he considered himself a so-called dynamic conservative. He was not any fan of the New Deal or the Fair Deal, but he didn't believe in rolling them back. He believed in Social Security and he believed in some of the safeguards of the New Deal. And so he was what we would today call kind of a middle-of-the-road sort of person. He didn't want price controls. He didn't want federal aid to education, which is a big deal, funding, as you know, for schools. But the idea of the federal government being involved in education, he was opposed to. And he didn't really believe in publicly supported housing by the federal government. He did push Federal Highway Act as a defense kind of mechanism, and so the interstate highways we travel on basically were a result of that. And he extended Social Security as opposed to oppose it. He raised the minimum wage. He did a bunch of things that today would be considered progressive or even liberal, even though Eisenhower himself would have called himself, and everybody at the time would have called him, a conservative. Now, the Cold War dominated, and the meetings back and forth with the leaders of the Soviet Union, the summit meetings, dominated, and the rush for superiority in nuclear arms and MAD, mutually assured destruction, and all those things really dominated the 1950s. But in doing that, and there was full employment still from World War II right along, and the country, for the most part, became affluent, which means wealthy or prosperous. Not that everyone was rich, But people worked full time and people brought home full paychecks, and it was a pretty good time to be a wage earner in America. It was a growth of white collar jobs and a little bit of a decline in blue collar jobs, that is, physical labor jobs, especially in factories, because of mechanization in the modern factory. And that trend has continued for the next half century right up until the 21st century. Also, it led people to have much more money than they had ever had. We remember the 1920s when people bought their Model T Fords and all those things, and there was a wave of consumerism. But those people bought everything on credit. They didn't have quite enough money. And people had a bit more money, relatively speaking, in their pocket in the 1950s than they ever had had back in the 1920s. And the same sort of things, though, were what were considered to be luxuries for them. Automatic washing machines, dryers instead of the old clothesline, air conditioners, and the new wave of the future of the 1950s television set, so you could watch the movies right in your own home. Also, as people had moved to town during the war, mainly because of the war, they didn't move back to wherever they came from. They kind of stayed in town, but they moved kind of out to the edges of town into not the urban area, but the suburban area, so-called bedroom communities. People had cars. They could drive back and forth. They could commute from place to place. Single-family houses built in suburbs around cities accounted for 85% of house construction in the U.S. in the decade of the 1950s. That's a heck of a lot of houses were built. And there they are. They were very famous for being cookie cutter, and you can see they all look alike. The most famous of those suburbs was a place called Levittown in New York, in which William Levitt bought a bunch of land and former potato farm and put houses. And you've seen suburban developments that look just like this. They're in and around Cleveland, in and around Pittsburgh, in and around any city you've ever gone to. There you can see it from the air. Nothing but houses. They were low cost. They were mass produced. People could buy them relatively easily from the GI Bill if they had been soldiers during the war. And they had enough money to buy a house. They had enough money to buy an automobile. And they could live in the suburb and drive to the urban center and do their job and get in their car and drive home. And these suburban communities grew everywhere. Any place there was a city, there was a ring of suburbs around those cities starting in the 1950s. Talked about the Highway Act to interconnect those cities. The idea of a freeway where you didn't pay. And this was also an era of a population boom known as the baby boomers. You may know that the baby boomers, if they were born in 1945 to 1955, were, retirement age now. And you may have heard, that the coronavirus is the boomer remover because it attacks people 60 years and older. But these were the babies of the post-war generation. And it was a boom because as the soldiers and sailors and Marines got back from war and reunited with their wives or got married, they immediately began to have families, began to have kids. And there was a boom in the number of babies. There you can see a bunch of babies have just been born. There was just a huge boom in the population. At the height of the baby boom, a baby was born every 7 seconds in the United States, and you can just see the rise in the birth rate. It fluctuates, but it's on the upward trend. Many technological advances in the 1950s that changed life fundamentally. In medicine, there were antibiotics that were developed in the 1930s and during the war years to save lives, and they continued to save lives after peace came back. techniques that were developed in the war. But the most dramatic thing that happened was polio, the thing that had made President Roosevelt a paraplegic. Finally was found a vaccine. Talk about the vaccine for coronavirus, that we're going to have this with us for years until a vaccine is developed. Finally, a polio vaccine, after many, many years, was developed. And there is sort of a poster child for polio. That is a little girl with, you can see, with the leg braces, and she's trying to walk. She can't really walk, and she has to prop herself with her crutches. And she had a relatively severe case, but not a terrible severe case, because she was not a quadriplegic. She was able to get around, much like President Roosevelt had been able to do. But it was a devastating disease that killed and crippled thousands and thousands of people yearly. There you can see, we talk about ventilators today. Before there was the ventilator, there was the iron lung. And the iron lung was what kept people alive. And some of the iron lung babies just have passed away in the 21st century. It was a terrible way to exist, but it was a way to stay alive. And you can see there's whole wards of people in these iron lungs. But in 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk developed a vaccine that prevented polio, and a different and slightly better oral vaccine was developed later. And what it did is it made polio really a thing of the past by 1960. There's the second gentleman, Dr. Albert Sabin, who had come up with a different type of vaccine. It's also the beginning of the age of computers, but we'll talk about that another time. So this all applies to your checklist, number 13, the final one of our assignments, and you can get busy on that really on your own using these notes to help you. Okay, we'll talk again real soon.